I find myself speeding down a road that is, for some reason, both familiar and unfamiliar. The sky arches above me like an ancient and angry sea, gray and melancholy, reaching down to the horizon to kiss the earth. I'm going to fall into the sky, I think to myself. My car will sink down into the clouds like a stone and will be there, and that will be the end of me. I smile at the absurdity, but grip my steering wheel tighter. The trees, what few there are that I see upon the road, are gnarled, ugly things. Benefited now of even their autumn foliage in their early November frost. My car is the sole occupant of a lonely stretch of highway, silently bringing me to my destination. It's a good day for a wake, I say to no one. Breaking the stillness of the day, my voice startles me as I retreat into my head. I let the yellow lines of the road and the monotony of the scenery hypnotize me, and soon my mind is wandering down familiar corridors. For what must be the thousandth time, I think of him. Seamus Hagen could pass for a good man when sober. He was boisterous, affable, and could talk to strangers as if he had known them their entire life. He could tell bawdy stories that could make men laugh well into the evening and tell sweet lies that could make women swoon. At parties, he was the center of attention, surrounding himself with all members of social strata. They gathered in their revelry to hear the outrageous stories and antics, but still, they did not know him. Beneath the thin veneer of personality, Seamus Hagen was unhappy. He harbored within himself an unending sadness that threatened to peek above the surface if he let it too long alone in his own mind. When I was young, my father looked up to Seamus. I feel like he idolized him in his own way. They had grown up together, and Seamus, who could never hold on to a wife for very long, was always trapezing through our home, an unwelcome guest, all but my father. I remember clearly the day I solved the riddle of his being. It was a crisp autumn day, the last of October, and I, for my part, was dressed as a cowboy. Seamus, who had been drinking again, looked me up and down and said, "What sort of get-up is that?" "I'm a cowboy," I replied. "Are you stupid or something, lad?" he said. "You're supposed to be a monster on Halloween, something scary." I grew silent and looked away from him. "Come here, sit down. I'm going to tell you a story of why you look so ridiculous." Seamus was never parted from his drink for long, and I could smell the beer on his breath as I approached him. His eyes had grown dim from the alcohol, but his voice was as melodious and commanding as ever. His breaths were steady and his pale gray eyes were fixed upon me. Obediently, I sat next to him in the chair and felt unsure of what to expect from the old drunk. I was at his mercy, and he began his tale. "Now, all this business of Halloween that you children get on about is sanitized, Christianitized versions of the festival of Sauin, celebrated by our heathen ancestors before St. Patrick taught us to fear the wrath of Jesus Christ. Now my mother, gone these 30 years, God rest her soul, she was something of an expert on Sauin, and while she was a God-fearing woman, she knew rightly that it wasn't wise to completely forget about the old ways. You see, the Druids knew on Sauin certain doors were opened temporarily, and the dead could come back for a night. To keep themselves safe, the Druids appeased the dead with certain rituals. Some of them were trickled down on us. They'd carve lanterns out of turnips to light the path way back to the underworld. They'd dig up corpses of newly dead and arrange them in a grotesque feast so that they wouldn't be hungry on their way. They'd go around town and find a little child. Then, in the fields that had been left fallow that year, they would construct a gigantic wicker man with the help of the townspeople. When it was complete, the child would be shut up in a head, and then the wicker man would be set all right while all the people joined hands round it and chanted to the gods and the dead, one living soul given as an offering to the dead, and to ensure their prosperity and leave them alone for one more year. No one went out on Sauin for the fear of encountering the dead in their grim procession and being dragged into the netherworld. Those travelers that could not help themselves but be on the road would rub chalk on their faces and charcoal under their eyes, or maybe wear some ugly mask so that if they were questioned by a dead man they met, they could just say, "No, sir, I am already dead. I am already among the dead." Seamus looked around and stood up from the chair. Somehow, I knew intuitively not to move yet. He returned in a minute with 2 beers, one which he offered to me, but I declined. He drained one right then and there, and then took nursing to the second. He swirled and churned the lager in his mouth, taking in the full of its flavor, trying to decide what to do next. After a moment, the alcohol began to affect him, and he continued the story. Now my mother, God rest her soul, was always beating me senseless when I got to sneaking out at night, but that only encouraged me to do it more, because fuck her, right? So one night, I was about your age. She tells me, "Seamus, you have the devil in you. You don't care one lick for your mother, but I am telling you, don't be sneaking out at night tonight. Tonight is the feast of Sauin, where the dead come up from their graves and follow grim Morrigan in procession in search of something living child to bring back to the underworld. For the dead despise the living. For the sake of your mother, stay in bed tonight." So naturally, that night, when she was asleep, I got on my clothes and I prepared to sneak out to see what mischief I could get myself into. Now, my mother's stories were rattling around in my head, and I must have believed them. Before I went out, I wiped my face and blackened my eyes, and stuck out of the window and set upon the road. Now I recall, Seamus paused here again and shifted his gaze uneasy around the room as if checking its dark corners for some unseen stranger. His breathing became deeper and his mind seemed in turmoil. Seamus's skin turned ashen, and for a moment I thought he would vomit. The words he meant to speak next were stuck in his throat, and feared he would spit them up. He looked down at the beer in his hand, quickly finished it, and grabbed another, filled with the courage that one often finds at the bottom of a beer glass. He cleared his throat and began again. So I went through the town, looking for what mischief I could get myself into, but I found no shop open. I was about to start vandalizing houses, and I looked into the distance beyond the town, and I saw a pale orange light flickering in the distance. I thought it must be some bonfire lit by like-minded children, and so I resolved to make my way towards it. In no time at all, I was in the woods outside the town on a narrow dirt path that passed for the road in Ireland in those days. I looked down on the road and saw a light moving towards me slowly. I realized what I thought was a bonfire in extreme distance was actually some old codger in a car. Determined as ever to make the best of a bad situation, I gathered up some good-sized stones to throw at the car as it passed by and hid in a bush on the side of the road. Seamus paused here for the last time, though. The pause was the longest. He didn't say anything or move, just continued staring off into space beyond relieving events in his own mind. Minutes passed, and I began to feel uneasy. He began to rock in his chair a bit, and I thought for a moment he was going to have a seizure, like someone I had seen on TV. As all at once he began speaking again, in a trance, as if no time has passed at all. I waited for that damn car to come. 5 minutes became 10 minutes, became 20. It was moving so fucking slowly, and I should have known I was no car. I was just about to get up I was just about to leave when I saw this big bird flew over me. It was like a raven or a crow, but it was the size of a house cat. It perched on a tree just beyond me and let out a screeching cackle that chilled my bones. I saw the road light and thought that the car had come at last. I crouched down and readied my stones, but inside of a car, I saw people, lots of people. It was some parade, I thought. But my eyes adjusted and realized they were all dead. At the head of the procession was a gaunt man, naked and bone white, carrying a scepter of polished bone on his head. He wore the skull of a horse and urged on the mass of corpses beyond him of his hideous gesticulations. Behind him came in no particular order the mob of the dead, old, young, women, men. It made no matter. Some looked nearly whole and could pass for a living, if not their unearthly paleness. Still others looked as rotten corpses. Blood and maggots dripped from their orifices. Still others were little more than skeletons who wore their flesh like a beggar wears rags on a hot summer day. They shambled along, held together by an unseen force. All of them carried small lanterns, some of them carved from pumpkins, others from turnips, and still from things I didn't want to recognize. The parade lasted for minutes, hours, years, millennia. Time stood still and yet jumped ahead as itself. It was over before it started, and yet lasted forever. All the while presided over by a grim bird who watched it all with dead and lidless eyes. Eventually, the shambled corpses in their unearthly light moved past me. The bird took air once again, and I was left alone in the bush, gasping for breath, and my heart threatened to beat its way out of my chest. I emerged from the bush and looked down the road. I saw the lights of the phantom parade safely in the distance and tried to collect my thoughts. When I heard a twig break behind me, I slowly turned and acted unsurprised, and maybe that's the only reason I'm here still today. In front of me was a young boy, pale, in tattered clothing. Pieces of flesh on his face were missing, and his throat was cut from the ear to ear. The blood would dribble down his shirt like a bib. In one hand he held a small pumpkin lantern, in the other a knife. I took only small breaths as he realized I was still breathing. He looked deeply into my cloudy eyes. He spoke to me in a gurgling voice that seemed more to escape from bleeding slit of his throat than his mouth.
Are you alive who walks among the dead? I'll carve you up and drag you piece by piece to my home beneath the earth, and you shall never see another sunrise. That is the promise I make to you, living boy.
No, sir. I'm already dead. I am already among the dead.
Liar,
said the dead boy.
I can hear the pitter-patter of your heart. It sings to me through the night.
Again I replied in a steady voice, No, sir. I am already dead. I am already among the dead.
I see your chest moving, living boy. Though you try to hide it, you will deny that?
No, sir. I am already dead. I am already among the dead. It stared at me for a long while. After toying that knife, I matched its gaze as best I could. After a while, the dead boy seemed to fade into the shadows around him, and then was gone, no longer there after the sun came up. Seamus didn't say another word. He just stared into the space ahead of him, looking like a corpse himself. After a few minutes, I got up and approached the doorway. He shouted at me. Then, but you don't understand. That's not the worst part of it. You don't understand what I saw in that parade that night. You don't know who was there. Who was there? I said. Everyone. Seamus never spoke of that day again. Perhaps he drank away the memory. When I was a few years older, he and my father had a falling out. I never asked about what, and I never saw him again. What I partly realized that day and elaborated on upon reflection was that Seamus believed that the fate of all men, saint, sinner, and everything in between was to join that hideous parade. It was their fate to be called down to a gloomy, sunless nether world where an eternity of languished sighs robs them of their minds and sanities, and they die a second death. Their jealousy of the living morphs into a deep well of hatred, and every solemn night they make home the land searching for someone to drag down with them and share the unending misery. The dread of one day joining the parade haunted Seamus and molded him into the man filled with fear, who tried all manner of diversions to hide from the truth that dodged his footsteps his entire life. That was the hell of destination of all men. I am driving down a road that is becoming more and more familiar. I see before me just ahead the dirt path that passes for a road in Ireland these days. The funeral home, not a mile from the house I grew up. Outside, my father waits, beckoning me to come in. It's a marvel how well death can mend fences. For what must be the 1,000th time I think of him, I tell myself, it was just an old drunken fool who tried to scare me. I say to myself, no man knows what becomes of us when we die. Perhaps it's for the best. For if we knew the truth of lurking horrors awaiting us on the other side of the horizon line, it would drive us mad. This thought, too, I push from my mind. No living man knows what becomes of us. No one could say to a certain what, if anything, Seamus saw that night, and no one can say what it meant. Whatever demons haunted Seamus in his life, he's beyond them now. Whatever waits for us on the other side, no man can say. But the one thing, at least, is true. Whatever waits for us, now, Seamus knows.